My 3 principles for eating are color, which we've already talked about, creativity, which we can get into, and then the third one, best for last almost, is diversity. And I would say we need variety in all things. Many times what happens with food is people get into food ruts, especially people with health issues where they come to you, they're on very defined, rigid diets, then they get a lot of fear. And so they don't have a lot of diversity. They stick to like the 7 to 10 things that they can have, and then they eat the same things over and over. And then you get other people where every single day of their lives they've have oatmeal for breakfast, like no deviation. They don't want to think about it. Food is just energy. Well, what we now know from the literature on dietary diversity is that diversity of our food is correlated with better gut microbiome health. So overall, our gut is fortified through those diverse compounds coming in. So instead of monoculture, we get polyculture. And further, we get better immune health associations. There are so many other associations. I mean, even with kids, one of the things that I hear from parents is, Deanna, I can't get my kids to eat the rainbow. And there is this one study in particular in which they gave kids three, I think it was three different vegetables versus one. And what they found was that the kids ate more vegetables when they had variety, when they had the three to select and choose those versus just having the one. Like if they had green beans versus green beans, peas, carrots, whatever. The human brain goes for a variety, which is also why the all you can eat buffets can also not be so good. When you see all that variety, it's kind of like, ooh, wow. You just want to take part in that. But overall, what we want to aim for, and I know that probably in Icaria and other areas like the blue zones, they can get to 200. But in some of the studies that we have, at least like the American Gut Project, 30 to 50 unique plant foods in 7 days. Now, let me just describe that a second because people may not know, like, well, what is unique? So that means that instead of going to the store and buying a bag of Red Delicious apples, to self-select and buy a Red Delicious, Pink Lady, maybe Granny Smith. Don't buy just one bag full of the same kind of variety so that you get the same nutrients, same phytochemicals for the most part. Vary it up. I live in Washington State, so we have a lot of apples here. So we actually do have a lot of variety available to us. So what I would say is you can have an apple on one day and then an apple on the next day, and then that counts as two. But if you had that same apple, Red Delicious on one day, Red Delicious on day two, it only counts as one. So you want variety. And so one of the things I did in one of my groups was I challenged everybody, and maybe, you've done this in your groups too, where I say, let's see how many unique foods you can get, plant foods. How many can you get in a week? And I had everybody track them. It wasn't about the amount. It was only about, just a little bit would still count. I had one woman from Australia that had over 200 unique plant foods. I think I had about 121.
I've
Well, it
actually done exercise with my groups that I have as well. I had about 160 plant
nice.
foods, so I was
Very good.
really surprised. I like your way of, instead of buying a whole bag of apples of one variety, buying several different varieties. I love that.
Correct. And then, you self-select, you can see which one is like not bruised. And, sometimes when you buy a bag of apples, it may be a little bit cheaper, but they're not all equal apples. Many of them are just, on their way out, not as fresh. And I love the idea of just hand selecting your apples. Or even, I for some people who say, Deanna, I don't have the time to sit there and pick out all my apples. Okay, so when it comes to greens, there are many types of bags of greens now where you have blends. You have baby kale together. Try to get something where you can get a mixture of those greens.
Mhm. So, could you talk a little bit about phytochemicals and some of the research that's being done now with, helping to change mood and behavior? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's pretty exciting because, I think most people realize that if you eat more fruits and vegetables, that you're going to reduce your risk for a number of chronic diseases. And we hear a lot of organizations talking about that, right? Reduce your risk for cancers, certain kinds of cancer, reduce your risk for type 2 diabetes, reduce your risk for dementia, all of those things, good science, we hands down can't refute that. But what we're seeing is that by having more colors, so here's my slogan or my mantra: colorful foods equals colorful moods. So, what that
Mm,
means is the more colors we have, and the science is really robust when it comes to looking at fruits, vegetables, plant foods, supporting mental health. So, reducing depressive symptoms, being associated with less anxiety. And here's the fun part: there are even like 2 or 3 different studies in which they look at how when people eat fruits and vegetables, they have greater associations with more curiosity, more creativity, greater sense of well-being, and even less psychological distress or stress.
mm,
So I think it's beautiful to see how, and especially those blue purple foods. Like I did a whole webinar once just on blue purple foods in the brain, and it was on mood as well as cognition. There's good science, and you would know this because of your work on proanthocyanidins, of how much a lot of those pigments do travel to certain parts of the brain that are responsible for learning and memory and even mood. So, yes, I mean, most people want to be healthy, but they want to be healthy so they can be happy. And
mm.
if we would know that fruits and vegetables, these plant foods, help us not just to be healthy and reduce our risk for diseases, but also confer better mood states, which kind of
Yeah,
makes sense too,
sure.
right?
Could you talk a little bit about? Some people think they can just go to the health food store, pick up a supplement that has some of these phytochemicals in them that they've concentrated them into a pill form, and they're going to get this amazing benefit. Could you talk about how the concept of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts when we're looking at these phytochemicals?
I absolutely believe that and know that to be true. I mean, who could do better than nature? Nature has everything in the right variety in that food to prevent potentially toxicity, to have, nothing that's in too great amounts, too low amounts, um, and the right blend. Whenever I see a supplement, it's not that supplements don't have their place, but what we miss in a supplement would be the complexity of what you have in food. I mean, just think of it, thousands of compounds in food versus maybe 3 select isolated compounds in a supplement. And do we really know how the body does with, thousands of milligrams of that particular compound versus maybe a handful of milligrams in a food, right? So there could be a different dynamic. Now, one of the places that we've seen that take off is with turmeric, right? So turmeric root. Now, here's where there may be a case for using turmeric compounds in a supplemental way to have some kind of therapeutic benefit or effect. And typically that's done under the auspice of a clinician or somebody who's guiding that process, right? To help people make the better selection with a product. But yeah, with turmeric root, you get a lot of different things that you won't get with a curcuminoid supplement. But the
So for
curcuminoids can
maybe
also be
maybe
good
for the
for.
benefit of our audience, it might be a good idea if you're going to use a supplement like that, like turmeric, to use the supplement, but also use the whole plant as a food as well.
I like that, or even to have the extract embedded into the whole plant matrix, right? So that you do have something that resembles the signature of the plant compounds.
Mhm. So I really want to talk a little bit about how what getting a lot of we're getting a lot of misinformation today, and a lot of these people who are trying to sell books or supplements are telling us that there are some anti-nutrients that are in plants, like for example oxalic acid or the lectins or some other plant compounds. What is your response to those people who say, stay away from those plants, stay away from the beans and the legumes and the plants that have the lectins in it? What is your response?
Well, Weston Petrosky, one of my graduate students from a couple of years back, and I wrote a review paper, and we published it in a scientific journal because I really wanted to know. Because every time I would lecture on plants, that was exactly the pushback I would get. Well, what about these anti-nutrients? So, just for the audience to understand, so there are select isolated compounds that have been identified that may block the activity or the absorption of certain nutrients. So, for example, tea, tannins in tea, which are essentially polyphenols, have been known to block iron from being absorbed. So, if you have tea close to a meal containing iron, you may reduce some of that iron absorption. Now, depending on who you are, that may be a good thing, that may not be a good thing. There can also be a workaround. You can have that same cup of tea 1 hour after having your iron rich meal. Let's just say you're iron deficient and you're maybe iron deficient anemic. So, tannins are listed as an anti-nutrient because they are known to block the absorption of certain minerals like iron. So, what we found in this paper, you already named some of them: lectins, oxalates, goitrogens, which typically we found in the cruciferous vegetable family. Some people get I was just going to
Phytoestrogens.
say phytoestrogens are on that. We almost put histamines into the paper because there's such a buzz about histamines as well in plant foods like strawberries or
Mhm.
spinach. So here's the thing. Here's what Weston and I came to as a result of looking into the science because I was concerned. I tell people of the benefits of plants and I wanted to know, I mean, are there some dangers and risks? And I do think that if we are eating plants out of their traditional context, so let me give a context on that. So if we are drinking raw juice of certain plants, large amounts over and over again without diversity, and out of the context of how that plant has been eaten, um, we may see some changes. Absolutely. I don't discount that. Let's just take oxalates as an example
Yeah,
because
back in
that's
the
one.
day, by the way, it reminds me, back in the day, I used to take beets and I used to juice beets and I would drink 16 ounces of beet juice until I got educated and learned about that wasn't such a good idea because of the oxalic acid.
Well, especially, yeah, and the beet greens too, and also just a lot of sugar. But I would say,
I would take
with
the whole
ox.
greens and I put everything in there, the whole green and the
Oh,
beans,
wow. Okay.
yeah,
Okay. I got it now.
the whole
Yeah.
plant. I was all about whole foods. I didn't have the
Gotcha.
education though.
Well, and there are ways to reduce levels of those compounds in our foods. Like heat will often inactivate some of those specific compounds, especially steaming, fermenting, autoclaving. When we let legumes soak overnight and then we rinse them, we're getting rid of a lot of these compounds. Then we cook them. So there are ways to bring levels of them down. But don't forget that we also have many other compounds in that plant that will oftentimes offset the effects of any potential anti-nutrient. Now with
Well, they've actually done
oxalates,
research with lectins and they found that there are some properties. They have anti-cancer properties.
yes, yes, you definitely, we put that in the article. There is some cell work, so some preliminary in vitro work to suggest that they may have immune modulatory effects. With some plant compounds, it's almost like, if you think back in the day of beta carotene, if you take a lot of beta carotene in a smoker's body, it can actually work as a pro-oxidant. So many times, an anti nutrient, what we would call an anti nutrient, might be reflecting something about the milieu or the environment of the body. Is it truly lectins or is it that the lectins in the food are signaling an immune dysregulation in the gut? Something to consider. Is it really oxalates or are the oxalates signaling that we have mineral imbalance? Like we don't have calcium, we don't have magnesium in the right proportions.
That's very interesting. I never really heard that before. That's really interesting.
Well, plants are smart. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. I think it's an NPR podcast that's called Smarty Plants. Plants are smart, and, maybe plants are actually signaling a message about where there's imbalance or dysfunction, rather